godly scorn. In our lives, there's a time of coming when glory.
Well, we need to wait a few seconds while people come into our virtual auditorium. So we have to wait just a little bit for the audience to come in. And once we see the numbers stabilize, we'll be able to actually start. And they're still going up a bit, pretty quickly too, in fact. That may be it for now.
You're on screen.
Yep. Welcome, everyone, to the Wilmette Institute's second web talk for June of 2010. And today we have Janet Fleming Rose of St. Albans in the United Kingdom speaking about Louise Mathew Gregory, Sowing the Seeds of Racial Harmony. And, of course, we will be broadcasting this live over YouTube and Facebook. So if you can't get in or if for some reason you get cut out, you can always switch over and watch it over there as well. Give a quick introduction to the Wilmette Institute. We've been around since January of 1995, so we've now hit our 25th anniversary. We ran a face-to-face program for a while, but then we started online courses in 98, and to date, according to my calculations anyway, today we have had 599 online courses with a total of 15,300 plus registrations for those courses. The people have come from 127 countries, and the thing that's really quite exciting is to see all of the different ways they've used their courses. They've given presentations, they've spoken on the radio, they've spoken in front of groups of people, they've produced some rather fascinating art projects, and in fact, one of the projects that is worth mentioning is this very book, which I'm sure was started before Janet started our course on writing histories and biographies, but I hope the course was of help in completing and working on that particular book. So this book was actually, to some extent, part of the results of the Wilmette Institute's efforts. We have also, since 2015, been running these various web talks, and we've increased the numbers of those. And we're now working our way towards the point where we hope to be accredited so that we can offer courses for credit on Bahá'í and related subjects. We'll see whether we can manage that or so. Meanwhile, I should also mention very quickly that we have several courses starting towards the end of June. On the 24th, I believe, of June, the Thursday, basically less than 2 weeks from now, we have 3 courses starting, one on the Baha'i Faith and the Arts, one on the Book of Revelation, and one on anti-Black racism in America. The last one is completely full. And then on July 1st or 2nd, whatever that Thursday is, some answered questions starts. We will be having some web talks in July and August, and that schedule will be announced shortly. Turning now to our speaker today, Janet Fleming Rose, who, as I said, is from St. Albans in the United Kingdom. What I thought was her biography proved to be actually more information about the book. And so I will probably just ask Janet, perhaps briefly, to tell us story and how she got interested in this subject, and then she can move right on and start on her slideshow. So Janet, thank you so much for joining us on this web talk series today. We're delighted to have you and very much looking forward to hearing you speak about Louise Mathew Gregory. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I'm very honored to be invited to give my talk today on Louise Mathew Gregory. And really, I feel I've come full circle because I did the Wilmette Institute course on how to write a biography, and then I wrote my biography of Louise Mathew Gregory, and now I'm going to give a talk on it. So I've come full circle, really. So I'm going to give a talk on my recently published book, A Seed in Your Heart, The Life of Louise Mathew Gregory. I'm going to start by explaining why I became interested in Louise, and I'll mention the major sources I used to research her life, and then I'll give a brief summary of her life and achievements before looking at some aspects of her personality and some Baha'i principles that I feel are illustrated by her life and her marriage. So, how did I become interested in her? In the winter of 2009 to 2010, my husband Andrew and I spent 3 months in Bulgaria. And we lived in the capital, Sofia. Sometimes this is pronounced Sofia in Bulgaria, a city, a capital city, which is named after the Greek word for wisdom. And this is a statue of a personification of wisdom in the center of the city. It's a beautiful city, so historic and surrounded by mountains, and it actually has thermal springs right in the center of the city. So while I was there, I read the excellent biography by Jan Yashin of Marian Jack, Canadian Bahá'í pioneer to Bulgaria. And as I was reading it, I noticed the name Louise Gregory kept cropping up. Well, Marian Jack came to Bulgaria somewhat unwillingly to assist Louise Gregory, but stayed for the rest of her life, experiencing great privations throughout World War II and the communist era, and passing away there at the age of 88. While we were in Sofia, we visited her grave, this is a photograph of it. So, as I mentioned, I became interested in Marian Jack and also in Louis Gregory. And when I went back to England, I started researching Louise's family background through genealogy and Bahá'í sources, and trying to find out more information about her and her life. This took a long time, and I often felt I was making no progress. It went in fits and starts. I would find out something really fascinating, and then for several months, I wouldn't find anything else, and I would become rather frustrated. But in 2015, I took the Wilmette Institute course on writing biographies. This was an excellent course, and I had a very inspiring mentor, the late Adam Thorne, who was very helpful and inspiring to me. Well, after completing the course, I realized that what I had to do next was to visit the United States National Bahá'í Archives in Wilmette. And so I made a trip there with my husband, and it was a revelation, really, because I discovered a wealth of letters that Louise had written to other people and that other people had written to her. And I realized that this would form the basis of a book about her. On the same trip, we visited. This is me just disappearing into the US Bahá'í archives, which are in the basement of the House of Worship there. On the same trip, Andrew and I also visited Greenacre, which had very strong connections with the Gregorys, and visited the Elliott Main Local Spiritual Assembly Bahá'í archives, where we found more fascinating documents and letters. This is a picture of the Sarah Farmer Inn at Greenacre. So back in England, I had some further places to visit to do my research, and one of them was the Thomas Cook archives. Thomas Cook, the travel company, which sadly is no more, has gone into administration. It had wonderful archives, which also very, very sadly, I believe, are no more. But I was able to get there in time and found lots of very fascinating travel guides of the era that I was interested in, and timetables from the early 20th century. And this is a photo from one of the pamphlets that I discovered there. And I really love this picture. It epitomizes to me our sense of adventure. And I think this is the sense of adventure that Louise had. It's a picture and advertising the Overland Desert Mail. And this was a passenger service based in Haifa that transported passengers across the desert by car, or as they called them, by autobus. And Louise travelled by this service when she travelled overland from Bulgaria to Haifa in 1929 on her second pilgrimage. I also, mentioning some other places that I visited to do research, I visited the Bromley Local History Library for local newspaper reports about her family. And I also visited the British Library in London, of course. So, and after that, it was time to start actually writing the book. So I'll move on to a brief overview of her life. She was born in the village of Penge in Kent, in the south of England, in 1866. This is a photograph of some almshouses, some old buildings, which I believe are still standing in Penge. She was given the name Louisa Alice Maria Mathew. Mathew was her surname. But in adult life, she preferred the name Louise. So my first decision, really, I had to decide when I started to write the book, was I going to refer to her in the book as Louisa or Louise? Well, because I knew that she always seemed to prefer Louise, and she always used it in her letters, and she only really used Louisa for things like passport applications and formal documents like this. So I chose to use the name Louise in the book. But Louisa Gregory, Louise Gregory, that's the same person. You know, it's just her choice, her preference of name seemed to be Louise. She was what you might describe as an upper middle class English family. Her father, Michael, was a self-made man who made a fortune from importing eggs and butter from France. And so in a way, he was a grocer, really, a wholesale grocer. He had come from very humble beginnings. He had been born on a farm near Beckenham in Kent, and he worked hard to raise himself and his family out of more or less poverty, really. They were very, very hard up. And after he had established his successful firm in London and become wealthy, he moved his family out of London to a large modern house back in Beckenham, not far from the farm where he had been born. And I like to think that it gave him pleasure to maybe just look along the road a bit and over the hills and see the farm where he had been born in very poverty-stricken circumstances. And now he lived in a big, wealthy house. Louise had 10 siblings who survived infancy. One little boy sadly died in infancy, but there were 11 of them, 10 siblings for Louise. So she was from a large family. Her eldest brother, Ernest, took charge of the French side of his father's business, and he settled in France, and he lived there, and he married a French woman. Another brother also married a young woman from France. So it seems likely that the French language was spoken and understood in Louise's family home when she was growing up. Certainly she was a fluent French speaker, and she later learned excellent German. And these languages were of great use to her later when she started her own travel teaching and pioneering efforts. Although Louise was born in Kent, she grew up in London because her family moved there when she was a child. She seems to have been educated at home, but in her 20s, she attended a college in Maida Vale in London. So also a little bit later after that, she went on to study at Royal Holloway College in Egham, Surrey. And this is a picture of the Victorian building there. The college was founded in 1879 by Thomas Holloway, who was a wealthy philanthropist. And it was founded as an all-women, all-female college. This photo is provided courtesy of Royal Holloway, which is now part of the University of London. So Louise did her studies there at Royal Holloway College, and at some point she decided what she was going to do, what her profession was going to be in her life. She decided she was going to be a qualified teacher. So she went to Edinburgh in Scotland, and she studied at St. George's College, but she also attended lectures at the University of Edinburgh. This is just a scene of the Edinburgh skyline, which is very dramatic, of course, and beautiful. So she studied under a principal at St. George's College, a woman who had for that time, very advanced ideas about women's education. And Louise became one of the first women in Britain to qualify as a teacher. In June 1895, she took her exams, which she passed, and she was awarded her Certificate in Education. That's her teacher's qualification. The exams were taken under the auspices of the University of Cambridge. The exams were organised by the University of Cambridge, but Louise never actually studied at Cambridge University. After qualifying, within a few years, she went with a friend from the college. They both went off to live in Luxembourg. And this is a photo of her taken during her time in Luxembourg. And she worked as a teacher. I think she started first by giving private lessons, private tuition, and then she worked as a teacher in a girls' school there in Luxembourg. And she spent 9 years there, and she made many friends. But after 9 years, she made a very important decision, and she decided to move to Paris. Well, at that time, there was a very vibrant Bahá'í community in Paris. And this is a photo of some of the people, the Bahá'ís that we associate with that community. The photograph actually predates Louise's declaration as a Bahá'í, but I wanted to talk about at least one of the people in the photograph. In the centre of the photo, of course, is Thomas Breakwell, who's recognised as the first Englishman to become a Bahá'í. He actually died in 1902. Next to him is May Bowles, who later married Mr. Sutherland Maxwell, and she became May Maxwell. And towards the back on the left is Hippolyte Dreyfus, the first French Bahá'í. So I chose this photo in particular because it shows Edith Sanderson. And Edith Sanderson is credited with being the person who taught the Bahá'í faith to Louise. We know this from letters after Louise decided to declare herself a Bahá'í. She wrote to Abdu'l-Bahá, and he mentioned that she should always be grateful to Edith Sanderson for teaching her about the Bahá'í faith. Edith was an American Bahá'í from California who had moved to Paris with her mother and her sister Sybil to promote her sister's career as an opera singer. And she was very much involved in this early Bahá'í community in Paris. So Louise became a Bahá'í in 1909. And in 1911, she travelled alone to Egypt to meet Abdu'l-Bahá. And this, of course, is a photograph of Abdu'l-Bahá, the eldest son of Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Bahá'í faith. At that time, Abdu'l-Bahá was residing in Ramleh, near Alexandria, in Egypt. So that's where Louise went to meet him. She took a pilgrimage. She actually, after that, she went to Haifa and Akka. But she met Abdu'l-Bahá in Ramleh in Alexandria in Egypt. And when she was there, she met Louis Gregory for the first time in the presence of Abdu'l-Bahá, which is a very nice, quite a remarkable thing to have happened. Louise had wanted to visit Abdu'l-Bahá as soon as she became a Baha'i, and Louis had also been waiting for some time to meet him. And then they both received their invitation to visit Abdu'l-Bahá, and it turned out that their visits coincided. So they met one another together, actually in the presence of Abdu'l-Bahá. Well, after leaving Egypt, Abdu'l-Bahá travelled in Europe, and Louise met Abdu'l-Bahá again in London and in Paris in 1911 when he visited Europe. And then subsequent to that, in March 1912, Abdu'l-Bahá sailed from Naples to New York in the SS Cedric to visit North America, and the Baha'is in North America were ecstatic. They were very, very happy that Abdu'l-Bahá was making this considerable trip to visit North America at that time. This is the list or manifest of passengers from the SS Cedric, and on line 8 you can see Abdu'l-Bahá's name, and on line 6 you can see Matthew, Louise, Alice, Maria. And we've just picked out the details of these two entries for you. So Abdu'l-Bahá, his age is given as 69. He's an author, and he's Persian, traveling from Ramleh, Egypt. That was the last place he was residing. And number 6, above that, Matthew, Louise, Alice, Maria. She's 46, and she's a teacher. Obviously, she speaks English. She is English. The last place that she resided was La Croix in France, and she gives her mother and her mother's address in Beckenham, England, as her nearest relative. There's a little bit more information here, which I will pick out for you. A line 8, again, this is the information relating to Abdu'l-Bahá, and it says that he's touring. Gives his height, 5'5", grey hair, blue eyes. Of course, he was traveling with his Persian entourage and a very small group of Westerners. So number 6, above that, you can see that Louise paid for her passage herself. She's 5'2". She has what they call a dark complexion. She has brown hair and brown eyes, and she's from England. And it says, there's a column, whether going to join a relative or friends. And somebody has written in, it looks to me like L. Gregory, and his address in Washington, D.C. So we could think this is significant, that Louis was her friend, and either she has suggested that his name be written there, or somebody has prompted her to have his name written there. And it looks as if she is definitely going to visit Louis when she gets to the USA. So you may be wondering why the book is entitled A Seed in Your Heart. The reason for this is that when they were on the SS Cedric in Naples before they departed, Abdu'l-Bahá said to Louise, "I saw a seed in your heart. Now is the watering time. I saw one seed in your heart. I wish it to produce many seeds." And Louise and any of us might wonder what was the seed. Later, Louise, having thought about this actually for a couple of years, she wrote to a friend, "The seed, I realized, was the attraction between Louis and myself. the watering time, the ripening of this feeling into love, leading to marriage. Its fruit, the one seed producing many seeds, the attraction of the hearts of the white and coloured races to be produced by our love and marriage. We wouldn't now, of course, use the word coloured. This was the terminology at the time. This was the word that was used when Louise reported Abdu'l-Bahá's words in her letter. So we've used the word here, but we wouldn't, obviously, in modern parlance, we wouldn't use that word now. So Louise travelled to the United States, and she presumably met up with her friend Louis again. And the story of their rather unusual courtship is very interesting, and I've written about it in the book. And it was obviously their engagement and marriage were being encouraged by Abdu'l-Bahá, sometimes very subtly, and sometimes perhaps not quite so subtly. So they decided that they would concur with Abdu'l-Bahá's wishes, and they would marry. So the couple married on the 27th of September, 1912. And Louis G. Gregory was an African-American lawyer. He was highly educated, and as we know, he was a Baha'i. He had attended Avery Institute, Fisk University in Nashville, and Howard University, Washington, D.C., where he qualified as a lawyer. And this marriage is considered the first Baha'i interracial marriage of the black and white races. And as I've mentioned, it's quite clear that it was encouraged by Abdu'l-Bahá. However, it was a most unlikely marriage in many ways. I just want to quote a little bit from my book, where I offer my opinion on their marriage. And not only were they of different races, one black, the other white, but they were also of different nationality and cultures, and from differing social backgrounds. She was from an affluent upper middle class family, accustomed to comfort, servants, and education, while he, though well educated, was the son and grandson of former slaves. In addition, she was 8 years older than her fiancé, her husband, and at 46 was entering middle age, while Louis was still in his 30s. However, what they had in common was their deep, abiding allegiance to the Baha'i cause and their devotion to Abdu'l-Bahá. Oh, so I forgot to comment on Louise. This is probably taken on her wedding day. She's looking very elegant. And here is Louis, also taken on their wedding day, and also looking very smart. So if we jump a little bit to 1935, at that time, the Baha'is in North America were required to fill in a registration card. And I think it's very interesting what Louise wrote on her card. That's her sometimes difficult to read handwriting. And she wrote, she first came to this country, meaning the USA, with Abdu'l-Bahá in 1912, having previously met him in Egypt, London, and Paris, and having been directed by him to go to America with him. Met Louis G. Gregory in Egypt at Abdu'l-Bahá's home. Our marriage made by Abdu'l-Bahá at Chicago. And this is a quotation. I made that marriage, Abdu'l-Bahá declared to Mrs. Agnes Parsons. I wish the white and coloured races to marry. I think it's significant that 23 years after their wedding, Louise still felt it was important to make this point that Abdu'l-Bahá had made their marriage. Well, before Louise sailed to America with Abdu'l-Bahá, he told her that if she went with him, there would be many difficulties. And after their marriage, they experienced many, many difficulties. For example, finding somewhere to live wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to find somewhere where they could be accepted as an interracial couple. This is over 100 years ago. This is 1912 we're talking about. They also had frequent money difficulties. And these difficulties really went on more or less throughout their nearly 40-year-long marriage. However, they were always united in their love for each other and for the faith. A few words about Louis. He was an inspiring speaker and teacher of the faith and was asked to undertake travel teaching trips on behalf of the Baha'i faith. He traveled widely and in many cases exhaustingly in North America, especially in the southern states of the USA. Doing this, he suffered humiliation as a Black man. Although he was highly educated and qualified as a lawyer, but there were laws in place in most of those southern states, which meant that he when he traveled, the means of transport that he had to take was inferior, and so was the accommodation. It was estimated at this time that an interracial marriage such as theirs was illegal in 25 of the states of the USA. So the result was that Louise couldn't travel to the southern states with Louis because their marriage was illegal there. They would have been arrested or possibly even physically attacked. Now, while Louis was traveling, Louise kept in touch with him by frequent correspondence, and she cared for him. She wrote letters to him advising him on what food he should eat. She was worried about his diet and keeping him healthy, and she looked after him when he came back home. However, in 1922, by this time, she was nursing the desire to travel for the faith herself. And in 1922, she had cause to visit England and Europe, and she began to undertake travel teaching trips abroad without Louis, because, of course, he was often in places where she couldn't go with him. And when she visited Europe, she was intending to teach the Baha'i faith there. Now, these trips of hers to Europe continued over a 14-year period. They went on for 14 years. She would always return home to the USA, sometimes after a few months in Europe, and sometimes after as long as 18 months away. But although they were separated at this time, she always longed for Louis to join her and to travel teach with her in Europe. This is clear from her letters to him. However, sadly, this was never possible. So in 1922, she spent some time in England, and then she spent 6 months in Luxembourg, where, of course, she had been for 9 years before her marriage. And later, she traveled south and east, teaching the faith in Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, the country, as that country, there's two countries now, but as it was called in those days, Czechoslovakia. So I have here a map showing the Balkan Peninsula, because really in her travel teaching and pioneering, she concentrated on the Balkans. So from this map, which I have to say is what you might call a schematic map, it doesn't show every detail, but it's to give you an idea of where places are. And you can see Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, another country which is divided up now, but at that time the country was called Yugoslavia. Italy is not in the Balkans, but it's there to give the context, so it's quite clear where the Balkans are. So she spent a long time, many years, teaching the faith in the Balkans. And she started in Sofia. You can see Bulgaria, and you can see, I hope, Sofia. And later, she was joined by her friend, Marian Jack. After difficulties renewing her residence permit in Sofia, she transferred from Sofia to Varna on the Black Sea, still in Bulgaria, but on the Black Sea, quite a distance from Sofia. This photo of her was taken in Varna, and on the left-hand side, there are notes in her own handwriting of the date, who it is, where she is, and stamped above that in Bulgarian, it says Varna. So we know for sure that's where it was taken. And then another photo from when she was in Varna. She held classes in English language, and also teaching about the Baha'i faith. And this is a photo of her with 4 of her students in Varna. She always looked very serious in photos. One reason for this was that she actually hated having her photograph taken. So it's very rare when you see a photo of her actually smiling in a photo. She always looks very serious. And she considered teaching study classes and her travel teaching her work, and she referred to it in her letters as her work. She later moved and based herself in Belgrade, in what was at that time Yugoslavia. Well, while she was doing all this over a very long period, traveling to these countries, she worked very much under the guidance of Shoghi Effendi, who was, of course, the grandson of Abdu'l-Baha, and he became the guardian of the faith after the passing of Abdu'l-Baha. And so she wrote to him frequently, reporting to him where she was and what she was doing there, how many students she had in her classes, and future plans of where should she go next. And she received at least 27 letters from him during a 26-year period. There may have been more letters, but those are ones that we know about. And she also worked very closely with Martha Root. Martha Root is sitting on the left side in this photograph. Martha Root, named by Shoghi Effendi as the foremost travel teacher in the first Baha'i century. And in Belgrade, she became friends with Draga Ilic. That's the lady sitting on the right-hand side. Draga, pictured here, of course, with Martha, but she also was a great friend of Louise. And Draga translated Baha'i books into Serbian. She was a very fervent Baha'i herself. Well, Louise kept up correspondence, not only with the Guardian, but with friends back in the USA, with, for example, Horace Holly, who for many years was secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States and Canada. And she wrote to her siblings in Europe. And of course, she wrote to Louis, her husband. This is a postcard, just an example of some of her correspondence. This is a postcard she wrote to Louise Thompson, a Baha'i who lived back in Elliott, Maine. And you can see she liked to cram in a lot of detail on her, particularly on her postcards. Sometimes her letters ran to 16 pages or more. Well, these are some of the places where Louise lived and where she visited across Europe. You can see the places in Britain where she lived, and Luxembourg, and you can see Geneva and the Balkan countries where she lived as well. And you can also see Haifa down there because, as I mentioned, she travelled from Bulgaria to Haifa on her second pilgrimage. But in 1936, Shoghi Effendi was urging her to leave Europe because by then it was too dangerous. This was the period just before World War II, and Europe in particular was really in ferment, and it was becoming too dangerous for her to be teaching the faith there. And so reluctantly, she acceded to the Guardian's wishes, and that was in fact her last teaching trip to Europe. But in 1937, she realized her ambition to travel and teach the faith with Louis. and they spent over 3 months in Haiti in response to a cable from The Guardian to the Bahá'ís of North America. So this is just a map putting Haiti into context. You can see it in relation to Jamaica, Cuba, Florida. By this time, she was really well past middle age and becoming quite an elderly lady. In their later years, the Gregorys were able to set up home in Elliott, Maine, close to the Bahá'í school at Greenacre. And this modern building at Greenacre is named for them. It's the Louis and Louise Gregory Cottage. But it is a modern building. Was never their home. But it's very nice that it's named for them. And here they are. This possibly is their home that they're standing in front of. Here they are in later life. And most likely this photo was probably taken in Elliott, Maine. And Louis passed away there in 1951. After his passing, Shoghi Effendi appointed him a hand of the cause of God, the highest honor for a Baha'i. This was in recognition of his services to the Baha'i faith. He was a brilliant speaker, a writer, an active member of the Race Amity Committee, and for many years a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States and Canada. Well, Louise, having suffered ill health and being very frail most of her life, lived to the age of 90. And she passed away in 1956. And she is buried next to her beloved Louis in Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Elliott, Maine. And these are their graves, which are kept in beautiful order. You can see how beautifully the flowers have been planted around it. I feel that their marriage embodies several important Baha'i principles, such as, for example, the unity of humankind. And I'd like to share some quotations on this theme. First of all, I have some quotations from my book on the Baha'i view of interracial marriage. There are quotations from Abdu'l-Baha, which are given in the book. At one point he said, "I made that marriage," Abdu'l-Baha declared this to Mrs. Agnes Parsons. "I wish the white and coloured races to marry." That was quite clear. And Abdu'l-Baha said to Louis Gregory while Louis was on pilgrimage, "Intermarriage is a good way to efface racial differences. It produces strong, beautiful offspring, clever and resourceful." And also, Marian Jack quotes Shoghi Effendi on interracial marriage. She reported, "He spoke quite at length on the question of mixing with the coloured friends socially, and even of intermarrying with them. He spoke of the Gregorys' marriage and said that Abdu'l-Baha must have had great wisdom in joining these two, and that it would have been an excellent thing if more people would follow suit." So their marriage was an example of interracial marriage, and I believe they were aware of this, the fact that they were serving as an example. And it was a living example of the Baha'i principle of the oneness of humanity. I just have a quotation here from Abdu'l-Baha. And it says, "For Baha'u'llah has proclaimed to the world the solidarity of nations and the oneness of humanity. Addressing all mankind, he has said, 'Ye are all leaves of one tree and the drops of one sea.'" Now, amongst the many difficulties that the Gregorys experienced during their marriage was the fact that they were the subject of gossip. And gossip is forbidden in the Baha'i faith. It's considered a very grievous sin, gossip and backbiting. Unfortunately, there were rumours that Louise had only gone abroad alone because their marriage was in trouble. And this caused great distress to them both because clearly it was not true. Well, I think we can see how harmful such rumors and such gossip is, because a rumor such as this, unfortunately, can even continue to the present day. When I was researching the book, and I mentioned to a Baha'i friend that I was researching, hoping to write a book about Louis and Louise, my friend said, "Oh yes, it was an unhappy marriage. She went off." Well, clearly this was not true. It was not an unhappy marriage. It's clear from their letters to one another that they were very happily married, and they missed one another when they were teaching on separate continents most of the time. The truth is, she only travelled without Louis because she couldn't accompany him on the work he was required to do in the southern states. So have a short quotation here from Baha'u'llah: "Backbiting quencheth the light of the heart and extinguisheth the life of the soul." I'd also like to consider something that I've heard mentioned several times, and I've heard it said that she was shy, that she was a shy person. Well, it's true that she was reluctant to give talks in public at first, but later she overcame this, and she spoke to audiences on the faith and even gave talks in German and Esperanto. This photo was taken at the German Bahá'í School in 1934, where she gave a talk. She's sitting in the centre there, is Louise, with her friend Marion Jack sitting next to her. So she was quite happy to give talks in public and to other Baha'is. And she would always take Baha'i literature with her on the long sea journeys and train journeys that she had to undertake. And she would take this literature with her in order to talk with people she met on her journeys and to give them Baha'i literature. So I don't think this is the actions of a shy person. So I believe she wasn't what you would describe as shy. She was perhaps reserved, and she was self-effacing. Especially, she was always happy to have Louis in the limelight, and for herself not to be in the limelight. But she was not afraid to speak up when necessary. She was, as you can tell from some of the facts I've mentioned from her life, she was an independent woman, especially in her youth. And we can see this for her desire for education, her education was above most women's education in the Victorian era. And we can see it from her travels before her marriage, as well as afterwards. Before her marriage, as I mentioned, she lived and worked in Luxembourg and Paris and established herself working and living there as a single woman. And then after her marriage, she travelled alone fearlessly to countries where she knew nobody. And although she spoke fluent French and German, which were very useful, she didn't speak any Bulgarian when she arrived there. So although we could say she was a very independent woman, nevertheless, she managed to maintain a loving marriage with Louis. In her letters, this is quite clear how much in love they remained, because she refers to him as my sweet boy, my precious darling. I find the story of her life is just such a wonderful story, and I feel privileged to have been able to bring her out of obscurity.
Thank you so much. I assume then you've just finished?
This is the end, yes?
Yes. That was so marvelous. Really a very beautiful summary of her life, of her characteristics, answering many of these questions that people had. And it's good to have her out of her husband's shadow, because she clearly made very important contributions to the faith as well and its growth in Europe. And this is a marvelous thing to have more information about. What do we know about her family, her parents and her siblings? And were they aware of her being a Baha'i? What did they think about the faith? Have you seen any letters, or have you encountered any information about their feelings?
Well, this is something that I'm frequently asked, and I don't have really any documentary evidence, but it's apparent that she kept in touch with her siblings, and particularly with her brother Ernest, who lived in France, and she visited him after her marriage, and also with at least one of her sisters, her sister Ethel, who she stayed with from time to time in England after her marriage. So, and also she does mention on the question of Baha'i literature, at one point she mentions she's got rather a lot of pamphlets, but she can save them and give them to her family back in England. So, yeah, but clearly they knew that she was a Baha'i. What they thought of this is really hard to tell, because here she was, a Victorian lady, and she had married an African American and gone to live in America, and she had embraced a religion that really was barely known in Europe at that time. So it's a very interesting question. I haven't found a lot of documentary evidence. Her letters to her siblings would be absolutely fascinating, and them to her, but so far I haven't been able to, they haven't turned up. I haven't found them.
Were her parents still alive when she married Louis?
Her father was not. He passed away, I believe it was the same year, or around the same time that she became a Baha'i. So her father was not still alive, but her mother was. And I believe her mother lived until 1917. I think that's correct. And I think it's significant that her mother didn't, I mean, she obviously was not shocked at what Louise had done, her marriage and becoming a Baha'i, because she still, in her will, she still left various items and some money to Louise. And I think if she had been outraged, she would have cut her out of her will. But she didn't do this. And as I mentioned before, none of the siblings seem to have ostracized her. She seems to have kept good relations with them.
I know in To Move the World, Gail Morrison had expressed uncertainty how the Gregorys made ends meet throughout their life, especially after Louis no longer had a job as a lawyer, and then after he was no longer employed by the National Spiritual Assembly as a traveling teacher. Have you been able to shed any light about that question?
Yeah, I think so, yes, from looking at the letters and documents. And particularly, I managed to get a copy of her father's will, which is very interesting, very long, detailed will. And in it, he made it a condition that whenever one of the children, that's Louise's siblings, whenever one of them died, the remaining siblings would receive a percentage, a certain amount from that brother or sister who had died. And perhaps it's a little bit macabre, but every time one of her siblings passed away, she received sometimes quite a large amount of money. And this, I think, that kept them going. And also she did have investments in England and received $50, I can't remember, either every month or every quarter. So she received, $50 was more than it would be valuable at now.
Yeah, probably multiplied by about 20, like that. So did she outlive most of her brothers and sisters? It sounds like she would have come pretty close at age 90.
There were so many of them. She outlived her eldest brother, Ernest. He passed away in France during the Second World War. But let's think, the younger siblings, they survived, I think, into the 1960s, some of them. But it was such a large family and a spread of ages that she did survive quite a lot of them. Yes.
I suppose you weren't able to find any of their children to see if there's any oral history or anything like that.
Well, no, I haven't done this, but it would be fascinating. Yes, it would. She had 3 sisters, and neither of the sisters had any children. Only one other sister married, Ethel, the youngest one. But some of her brothers married. I think most of them married, actually. There didn't seem to be any children from the marriage of her brother Ernest in France. When I was again able to get a copy of his will, he didn't leave anything to any children of his. But yes, some of the other brothers had children. Some fought, I forget now the details, but some fought in the First World War and then again in the Second World War. So there may be, and it's an unusual name. She suffers from having her surname misspelt very often, because Mathew, it's Mathew. It's a single T and no S on the end. So quite an unusual spelling of the name Mathew. So in some ways it might, if I took this on as a project, I might be able to find some surviving relatives. I haven't done this yet.
Yeah, and it's quite possible that some of them may not continue that spelling also. Because that can happen sometimes too. People sometimes will change the spelling of their name just because of everybody else misspelling it or something.
Well, I can. It's
very interesting. What sort of investments did she have?
No idea. Yes, I don't know. She just refers in her letters to the money that she gets from investments. Her parents, her father had obviously bought quite a lot of property, houses in London, and it was a condition of his will when he passed away. These houses were being rented to people, and they were not to be sold for 5 years, which was pretty generous. So the people who were renting weren't turfed out immediately from the houses. So 5 years elapsed. And I think it's significant that her mother passed away in 1917, and it was 5 years later, 1922, that Louise made her trip to Europe, possibly with a view to supervising this, the sale of this property and the effects of the will.
Interesting. I know in 36 they went to Haiti, and 37?
Yeah.
That must have been their first real opportunity to teach the faith together on a traveling situation, I suppose. They were there just a few months, right?
Yes, just over 3 months, I believe. Yes. Louis wrote a report afterwards, which is in the United States Bahá'í archives. And it seems to have been a very frustrating trip, really, because the government didn't want to welcome Baha'is to be teaching the faith there at that time. This changed later, of course, but at that time it was and they came up against obstacles the whole time they were there. Were hoping to start study classes, which of course Louise had a lot of experience in. And she, being fluent in French, that was of help in Haiti. Yes, it really looks as if they didn't make a lot of progress, but there again, they sowed the first seeds, didn't they? And I think it must have been difficult for her, because when she was pioneering in Europe, Central Europe, where the summers could be very hot, she had a lot of trouble with hot climate, hot weather, and she would go off to the mountains or somewhere to find a climate in the summer that was better for her. So I just can't imagine quite how she managed in a tropical climate. She would have found that really very difficult, I think.
Yeah, I can imagine. Where did they mostly live in the United States? I know they were in Washington, D.C. They were in Somerville, Massachusetts. I know that because I lived there once. They were in Eliot, Maine. I get the impression that they mostly northeast. Washington.
Mostly, yeah, apart from Washington, yes, and New England, Portsmouth, they move so many times. I tried to keep track from their correspondence with how many times they moved, where they lived. Occasionally, they had enough money to buy a house, and they would buy a house, and then it looks as if they fell into hard times, and they would rent the house out to somebody. Have to live more or less in lodgings themselves. And then I guess they rented accommodation themselves, and they moved around so many times. Very, very difficult to keep track of where they were living and when. But they certainly, particularly in that older age, they were able to settle in Eliot, Maine, and seemed to have been very happy there.
Yeah, and they both passed away there, and they're buried there.
Mm.
Yeah, I've seen their graves there in the cemetery, and Baha'is often, when they're visiting Greenacre, will make a trip over to that cemetery and
Right.
say some prayers at their graves. I know that.
Yes, we did that. Yes.
I gather Louis had a automobile accident at some point also, towards the end of his life there in Eliot.
Yeah, there's an anecdote about this. In their final years, the money problems seem to have resolved, and I believe that was mainly from bequests from the siblings who were passing away, and particularly the brother Ernest in France left. He was a very successful businessman in France, and he left quite a considerable fortune. She inherited a large sum of money from him. So I believe because of this, that's why Louis bought a car. And there are, I don't like to spread rumours, but there are rumours that his driving could be a little bit erratic. And he did apparently hit a tree in the Eliot area. And after that, he was quite elderly by this time. I think he was in his 70s, and passed the driving test and everything, but it didn't work out very well. So that was the end of the automobile experience.
She actually lived in Varna and Sofia, as you said. Were there other cities in Eastern Europe where she lived for many months at a time, or did she mostly travel?
It would be Belgrade, what was then Serbia, but it was then Yugoslavia. She lived there for quite some time. She would start off by living in a hotel, and then she was actually very good at making friends. And if a friend found her an apartment, she would move into an apartment, or sometimes share with one of her Esperantist friends, or some other contact that she had made. But she did visit at least Prague and Vienna and Budapest as well. Yes. But
did she spend a fair amount of time? Whenever she went over, did she also visit relatives in England and France?
She seems to have done. She seems to have visited. Particularly her youngest sister Ethel, who was married, and also she kept in touch with the younger brothers who, to a certain extent, managed her finances. And they would write and tell her how much she was going to inherit, and there were some bequests. So yes, she may possibly have stayed with the brothers as well in England. Yeah.
In the birth order, where was she? I mean, out of those 11 kids, have you figured that out?
Yes, she was about third. Ernest was the eldest. Not sure if there was another brother. And then Flora, she was the eldest daughter, and Louise followed her in order of birth. I think there was 2 years between them, and they may have been educated together at home. I'm not sure. I'm surmising that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. it probably is to your advantage to be one of the older ones that way. At least you have the experience of helping to raise the younger ones frequently.
It must have been a very, very busy and rather noisy house, I think, with all these children, especially lots of little boys all running around.
Yeah, yeah, that's. I'm sure that would be the case. You said that she had taught in Luxembourg. Was when she was teaching, did she also teach in Paris? Do we know whether she was doing any teaching in Paris? And was she teaching like in private schools, basically?
I think it was a government school in Luxembourg. I'm afraid the information is rather hazy about what she was doing in Paris. I'd like to know a lot more about that. Excuse me. But she, when she travelled with Abdu'l-Bahá on the Cedric, and I showed the pictures of the manifest, she gives her profession as teacher. So, and that she lived in this place called La Croix in France, which I'm not really being able to identify. So clearly she was still a teacher when she lived in France, in Paris.
There may be a lot of places named La Croix, actually.
Yes.
That sounds like it could be common enough.
Maybe a suburb of Paris, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
interesting. Good to have some more information about it.
And we don't know how she met Edith Sanderson.
Well, again, surmising really, because Louise was a singer. She had a very attractive soprano voice, and she trained as a singer. And there were musical evenings that some of the Baha'is organized. And it's possible that she went along to one of these musical evenings, and surprise, surprise, she met the Baha'is there, not just musical friends, but people who actually had embraced the Baha'i faith. So although clearly Edith Sanderson was her spiritual mother, if you like, Marion, Jack, Hippolyte, Dreyfus, they also had a hand really in helping her to understand about the Baha'i faith. And she mentions their names in her letters, I believe, to Abdu'l-Bahá.
Do we have any sense of why Abdu'l-Bahá wrote her specifically and invited her to come to America with him?
Well, we may conjecture. Why?
Was that seed?
I do a little bit of conjecture myself in the book to wonder. It's clear that Abdu'l-Bahá wanted Louise and Louis to marry. Mm-hmm. Why Louise? But particularly as they came from different backgrounds, and she was already 46 years old. Why? But who knows? I mean, we can't know what Abdu'l-Bahá was thinking at the time. But she was used to settling in a different environment. She'd lived in continental Europe and in Luxembourg and Paris, so she presumably wouldn't have too much trouble settling in the United States. She was able to cope with difficulties. We imagine there were certain difficulties in living abroad as a single woman at that time, and she was very persevering. More than that, we can't know really, unfortunately. But it's a fascinating question, and then her own report is on, as I showed the registration card. She writes that Abdu'l-Bahá invited her to travel with him to the United States. In one of the letters, it's not clear whether she had it's clear that she had a conversation with Abdu'l-Bahá before they sailed, and he apparently said, you said that you didn't want to come to America, but now you do. So there's a kind of a dilemma: was she going to travel with him or not? It's difficult to know whether the desire to travel with him was started with her, or whether it was entirely at Abdu'l-Bahá's instigation. Hard to know.
Yeah. Did she go on pilgrimage by herself, or did she have any traveling companions?
Are you referring to the pilgrimage, the first one to Egypt?
Yeah.
She appears to have traveled on her own. It seems likely she would have traveled with Thomas Cook or a similar travel company.
Sure.
And they were very good at looking after single ladies, apparently. It wasn't unknown for a single woman to travel. And then when they'd be put on the ship, there was so much, and most of the travel was by ship or by train, of course. And then when they arrived at the destination, the cook's man would be there to meet them and to show them where the hotel was and to more or less look after them. But we don't, at the moment, have any documentary evidence of her trip to Egypt to visit Abdu'l-Bahá, but we do know she was there, and she appeared to. There was a Mr. Meakin was there at the same time, but it is very unlikely that she travelled with him. I think he probably went on his own as well.
There have been various references in other people's pilgrims' notes about traveling with Thomas Cook. So certainly that does sound quite likely. And I know of two other couples Abdu'l-Bahá did matchmaking for. So Abdu'l-Bahá did have a certain interest, of pensions in doing this. One, of course, the most notorious one was Charles Mason Remy and Juliet Thompson, which did not work out. But the one that did work out was with Harlan Ober and I think it was Grace Robarts, who did indeed get married and had a very happy marriage afterwards. So Abdu'l-Bahá's managed 2 out of 3 at least, which is pretty good, I guess. He must have had a certain intuitive sense of these things. And of course, with Robarts and Ober, he was marrying a Canadian and an American. So there's that too.
Yes, it's a nice thought that he was obviously enthusiastic about doing this. Yes,
and marriage in general, I suppose. I'm trying to think if there's any other questions that we have. I don't see any right offhand. See if I can think of anything else to ask myself. So from 1912 to 1922, she was in the United States without traveling to Europe. So during those 10 years, when he was traveling in the South, she was basically staying at home.
This seems to have been the case. Although I believe she did travel to other towns occasionally. I forgot exactly where. But she did some traveling within the United States on her own account. But mainly, I believe she was staying at home, which, from what I can gather from her personality, would have been rather difficult for her because she was a very proactive person, although, as we said, self-effacing in many ways. But she was very good at making her own plans and deciding what she would like to do. And then she would refer to Shoghi Effendi to see if he agreed. He usually always really encouraged her. But yes, that 10 years, I think, must have been very hard for her.
She didn't have a job. She wasn't a teacher at all during that period of time.
She had private pupils. And really, after the teaching in Luxembourg and possibly in France, she only had private pupils. She taught French in the United States, and then she would teach English when she went to Europe, particularly in the Balkans. And that would be private classes or a small group, maybe 3 or 4 people. And from those small groups, she was always really able to introduce the Baha'i faith. And often people would become interested from knowing her and hearing about it.
Well, I don't see any other questions right offhand. And this has been quite a fascinating presentation. I'm really very grateful for your work and for putting the biography together and for making this contribution to our series of web talks today. So I want to thank you again, Janet, very much for
Pleasure.
all that you did. I'm glad that we were able to arrange this, and I hope perhaps you're going to write another one sometime. Probably not, but I don't know. Are you interested in writing anything else?
People do ask this. I have a couple of ideas, possibly, that I'm toying with, but nothing is imminently coming forth.
And we should probably close with at least some description of your background, because we never did get that, I'm afraid. I apologize that that never got up on the webpage, so I didn't have access to it.
Okay, right. I was born in Surrey, which is in the south of England, actually in Epsom and Ewell, and I went to school there. And then I attended the University of Edinburgh, where I studied modern languages, Spanish and German. And then after that, I qualified as a professional librarian. I took my postgraduate librarian qualifications at the Polytechnic of North London. Now it's the University, I believe, of North London. And after that, I had a very varied career, sometimes as a children's librarian, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And also I worked in technical libraries, civil engineering libraries, and I worked, I worked in Surrey. I started with the Surrey County Library, and I worked in Scotland, and I worked in Fiji. I went to Fiji for 2 years and worked in a community library there, and I actually became a Bahá'í in Fiji.
Really?
Pacific. And after that, immediately after that, I went and I worked in the National Library of the Republic of Maldives in the Indian Ocean. So I was there as advisor to the National Librarian, and then came back to England for a few years, worked in a technical library. And then I had the bounty of serving for 6 years in Haifa at the Bahá'í World Center Library, where I served as the acquisitions librarian, which was a fascinating job. Absolutely loved it.
I bet.
And then I came back to England, and 6 years after that, I married Andrew, and we now live happily in St Albans in Hertfordshire.
Very good, very good. Well, thank you again for your contribution to this series and to your excellent book. I congratulate you on a fascinating bit of research and scholarship.
Fascinating life. Fascinating woman, fascinating life. Really.
Yes, and you had you also have the bounty of having parallels too, having gone to the University of Edinburgh just like her and that sort of thing, which is, I think, always something that's very exciting to any author when they find parallels with the person that they're studying.
This is so true.
Yeah.
And also, I'd like to say I'm very grateful to the Wilmette Institute for their excellent course, which really set me on the right track.
Well, that's good. I'm really glad to hear that. And that was also true of someone else who wrote a very good book about Jameson Bond and Gail Bond and their pioneering work to the Canadian Arctic. And that book also came out through George Ronald perhaps a year or so ago. So that book also was partially shaped by the experience of taking a Wilmette Institute course. So thank you again. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today with this web talk. And we will be announcing July web talks shortly. We hope to have some more talks on the subject of race unity and the issue of race in America. It's a hot topic in a hot summer. And we hope that we'll be able to contribute to some of the discourse about that. So again, thank you, everybody, and we appreciate your participation. Thank you again, Janet, and we look forward to seeing people again in July. Bye-bye.